In this presentation and the following presentation, we are going to look at Sharif Girgis' argument on the subject of legal recognition of same-sex unions as marriage. Right. To recap, I want to emphasize something I talked about in previous videos. The question we're dealing with is the following. Should we accept the following claim? If a same-sex couple meets all of the criteria that an opposite-sex couple would meet, except for the criteria about sex and or gender, then the government should recognize their union as marriage. More precisely, a lot of people will argue that if they request that the government recognize their union as marriage, then the government should recognize it as marriage. Girgis' thesis is that this is not true. He argues that the government should not, in any case, recognize the union of two people of the same sex as a marriage. I want to stress here, he is not making an argument about whether or not there should be civil unions for same-sex couples. He leaves that question aside. He's going to argue that the status of marriage should only be conferred by the government on couples, on a couple that consists of a man and a woman and who meet certain other criteria. Adults of sound mind, not currently married to someone else, and a number of other criteria. But for our purposes, the key point is he's going to argue that the government, whether or not it should give some kind of status of civil union to certain unions of two men or two women, it should only confer the status of marriage on some subset of the couples that are opposite sex. Here's what we're going to do in this presentation. First, we're going to look at the overall structure of his argument. And I'm going to break the argument down into three main claims. I'll call them point A, point B, and point C. Then we're going to look at point A and point C. Now you might wonder, so why are you skipping point B? Well, here's why. The arguments for point B are pretty complex and subtle, and they need really to be treated on their own. So I'm giving point B its own presentation. So in the next presentation, I'll go over point B, I'll explain what it means, and then I'll explain Girgis' reasons for believing that it's true. And then in the third presentation, I'll talk about how we can productively disagree with Girgis. I'll argue that if we want to disagree with Girgis, we're going to have to affirm one of a number of claims. So I'm going to lay out a series of claims, and I'm going to say, if you don't accept any of these claims, then you're pretty much going to have to say that Girgis' arguments works. Now, I'm not saying we should accept those claims, I think all of the other claims are plausible, or at least some of them are plausible. But, it's helpful to ask ourselves, so if we don't agree with Girgis' argument, in what way do we disagree with Girgis? Which of the alternative claims do we agree with? Or, if you end up agreeing with Girgis, I'll also say that if you're going to agree with Girgis, then there's a couple of questions that you need to answer, and I'll explain what those questions are. So it'll be mainly how to disagree with Girgis effectively, and it'll also talk about some things that you're going to need to argue if you agree with Girgis' argument. And let me stress here, what we're mainly discussing is whether the argument works. If the argument doesn't work, well, then the argument doesn't work. There might be another argument out there. But this is one of the best, most sophisticated arguments for the claim that the government should not give the status of marriage to same-sex unions that I've seen. So we're going to look at it in depth, and we're going to discuss on the discussion board whether or not we think the argument works. If so, why? If not, why not?